The earth was above him and the sky was below. That is what it looked like through the canopy of his P-51D Mustang at roughly 25,000 feet above central Germany on the afternoon of November 2, 1944. Captain Donald S. Bryan, 328th Fighter Squadron, 352nd Fighter Group, 8th Air Force, had been inside this fight for perhaps 10 or 12 minutes. He had already shot down 3 Messerschmitt Bf 109s that afternoon. He had damaged 2 others. His ammunition was running thin. And a German pilot whose name he would never learn had found him in the middle of the largest aerial battle over the European theater in months, had settled into a position directly behind him, and showed no sign of breaking off. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Whoever the man was, he was different from the other Bf 109 pilots Bryan had met that afternoon. His aircraft moved with a responsiveness and speed that exceeded what Bryan had encountered all day. Every break Bryan tried, the German anticipated and countered. Every angle Bryan worked to create, the German closed. The tracers coming past the canopy were not warnings. They were each one a refinement, a small correction in the German's calculation of lead angle, every burst slightly more accurate than the last. The man was measuring him. Bryan tried the brakes he had learned across 2 tours and more than a year of combat. He pulled hard left, combining heading and altitude change. The German followed. He reversed and tried the other direction. Still there. He gained altitude, trying to force the German into a climbing turn that would cost him speed, then dove to generate separation. Still there. The tracers were close enough now that Bryan could see their individual paths against the pale November sky. He reached for the one thing he had not tried. A maneuver he had been taught by a skilled instructor pilot during training, practiced mentally over months, and never used in actual combat. He pushed the stick forward, unloaded the aircraft, and let the Mustang do what it would do when you stopped fighting it. The tail snapped in to end with the nose. The aircraft corkscrewed through itself. Bryan floated against the canopy while Germany wheeled above him in a slow, disorienting revolution. When the Mustang found level flight again, pointing the opposite direction, at a lower altitude, at a lower airspeed, the German pilot had vanished. "It is absolutely impossible," Bryan would say in a 1989 interview, "for an aircraft behind you to see where you went." He let his breathing settle. Then he turned back into the fight. The briefing rooms at 8th Air Force bases across eastern England on the morning of November 2, 1944, went quiet in a specific way when the target maps came out. Aircrews read a target by how the room responded when the curtain was pulled back. A murmur sometimes. Occasional dark humor. When the red line on the mission map ended at Merseburg, what the room produced was a particular kind of silence. The I.G. Farben Leuna work sat a few miles outside the city of Merseburg, deep in the industrial center of Germany, and by the autumn of 1944, it was the most important synthetic fuel plant in the Third Reich. 3 square miles of buildings, processing towers, cooling systems, and pipeline networks, all of it organized around the Bergius hydrogenation process, a method of converting brown coal, of which Germany possessed vast reserves, into aviation gasoline and synthetic fuel. The plant had been running this process since 1927. By 1939, it supplied roughly half of Germany's total aviation fuel. By 1944, after the natural petroleum fields available to Germany had been cut off or depleted, Leuna and its sister plants were not supplementary to the Reich's fuel supply. They were it. The 8th Air Force had been trying to destroy Leuna since May 12, 1944, when the systematic oil campaign against Germany's synthetic fuel industry began. After each attack, the plant's massive repair organization, drawing on a workforce that included 10,000 prisoners and forced laborers, brought production back online with a speed the American bombers could not reliably interrupt. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey's post-war accounting found that the sustained campaign reduced Leuna to roughly 9% of its normal capacity from May 1944 onward. That 9% still mattered, which is why the bombs kept coming. The Germans understood what they were protecting. The 14th Flak Division assigned to Leuna's defense comprised more than 1,700 heavy anti-aircraft guns in concentric rings around the facility, 88 mm and 105 mm batteries, radar-directed, capable of maintaining a precisely calibrated wall of steel across every altitude an American bomber formation might use. One B-17 pilot who flew there multiple times wrote afterward, "When I describe the flak over Leuna as a cloud, I don't mean just a wall of smoke. It was a box, the length, width, and depth of our route to the bomb's away point." The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey later concluded that aircrews considered a mission to Leuna the most dangerous and difficult assignment of the air war. The flak was only part of it. For the November 2nd mission, the 8th Air Force dispatched 638 B-17 Flying Fortresses, escorted by 642 P-51 Mustangs and a smaller number of P-38 Lightnings, all of it based in eastern England, and sent more than 500 miles into the German interior. American intelligence had apparently worked to conceal the intended objective. The Germans were not fooled. The Luftwaffe scrambled approximately 490 fighters, the largest single response to an 8th Air Force mission since early September 1944. The bombers flew toward Merseburg into anti-aircraft fire and the largest organized German fighter opposition the campaign had faced in months. By the time the day ended, 38 B-17s had not come back. 28 fighters were gone. 481 of the 638 bombers that reached the target returned with damage, more than 80% of the force that flew to Leuna that afternoon. And the bombers reached Leuna. What they flew into when they arrived deserves a moment of attention before the fighters take over the story. The Leuna complex employed 35,000 people, and by 1944 approximately 10,000 of them were prisoners and forced laborers with no choice about being present. They worked the production lines and the maintenance crews and the repair gangs under the industrial logic of a state that had decided the plant's output was non-negotiable. When the air raid sirens went, they sheltered in company bunkers that the plant's internal air raid protection organization maintained with the same thorough administration as everything else at Leuna. The 5,000-person firefighting force included conscripted women. The radar-directed anti-aircraft batteries were staffed in part by auxiliary personnel from across the occupied territories. Protecting Leuna was not a military garrison problem. It was a mobilized society problem, and the Reich had mobilized accordingly. This is what synthetic fuel production looked like when survival depended on it. When the bombs fell inside the plant gates, which happened on only 5% of radar missions and 29% of clear-weather missions, according to the Strategic Bombing Survey's post-war analysis, they fell on the same people who were producing the fuel and the same people who had no option but to produce it. Outside the gates, the bombs fell on the decoy buildings the Germans had constructed to draw off the loads that missed the plant, and on the farms and roads of Saxony-Anhalt that happened to be near a major industrial target. None of this was visible to the crews at 25,000 feet. What was visible was the smoke and the flak. On November 2nd, the flak barrage at Leuna lasted 18 minutes of heavy fire as the formations crossed the target area, followed by 30 additional minutes of sustained fire as the bombers completed their runs and turned for home. B-17 pilots described what that looked like from inside the formation. The sky going dark from concussion particulate, the rhythm of shell fragments hitting the airframe in unpredictable staccato, the smell of cordite working in through the oxygen system, the visual sensation of the aircraft ahead and the formation suddenly spraying aluminum debris and beginning to fall. The veteran crews had stopped flinching at the noise because flinching had been conditioned out of them over months of the same. The new crews flinched and did their jobs anyway because the formation held them on course and the mission required it. 1B-17 navigator on the November 2nd mission, 2nd Lieutenant Robert Femoyer of the 447th Bombardment Group, was struck by 3 anti-aircraft shell fragments over the target, severely wounded in his side and back. Offered morphine, he refused it. He wanted to keep his mind clear enough to navigate his crew out of danger. Unable to stand, he asked to be propped up so he could reach his charts and instruments. He directed his aircraft's navigation for 2.5 hours, guiding the crew away from further flak concentrations and back toward England. He permitted a sedative injection only after the aircraft reached the English Channel, and he was sure the crew was safe. He died after being removed from the plane. He was 23 years old. Congress awarded him the Medal of Honor posthumously. 5 men received the Medal of Honor or Distinguished Service Cross for their actions on November 2nd, 1944. Donald Bryan was one of them. Robert Femoyer was another. They had in common a day above the same coordinates of Germany, and beyond that very little, one in a fighter cockpit shooting down aircraft, one in a bomber navigating wounded against the pain of 3 shell fragments in his body, both doing what the mission asked of them past any point where a reasonable person might have stopped. Donald Septimus Bryan was born August 15, 1921, in Hollister, California, and grew up on a farm near the small community of Piscines, in the dry hills of San Benito County, about 100 miles south of San Francisco. Farm country in that part of California in the 1920s meant early mornings, physical work, mechanical self-sufficiency, and the kind of patience that comes from working with things that do not hurry. None of those qualities has a place in the mythology of the fighter ace. All of them show up in what Bryan actually did. He found aviation before the war, made aviation matter to everyone. Bryan obtained a civilian pilot's license before enlisting, flying at the level someone of modest means in the late Depression could afford, which was not very high or very often, and by his account the only obstacle to flying more was money. On January 6, 1942, less than a month after Pearl Harbor, he enlisted in the aviation cadet program of the U.S. Army Air Forces. He graduated from flying school at Luke Field, Arizona, in July 1942 in Class 42G, completed P-40 Warhawk transition training, and was assigned to the 328th Fighter Squadron of the 352nd Fighter Group at Mitchell Field, New York. The 352nd deployed to England in July 1943 aboard the troopship RMS Queen Elizabeth and settled at RAF Bodney in Watton, Norfolk, under the 67th Fighter Wing of the 8th Fighter Command. They were a P-47 Thunderbolt group then, the wide, blunt-nosed Thunderbolt being a different animal than the Mustang, heavier and more rugged, built for a different kind of fighting. Bryan named his P-47 Little One after his fiancée Frances Norman, and flew it through the autumn and winter into the spring of 1944 on the deepening campaign over occupied Europe and Germany itself. The early months of 1944 were the months the 8th Air Force began pressing into Germany in force. On January 29th, Bryan and his wingmen shared in the destruction of a Focke-Wulf FW-190 over Belgium. The following day, he shot down a FW-190 solo over Emmen in the Netherlands, his first confirmed individual kill. In February, he and 2 wingmen shared a Messerschmitt Bf 110. In late February and mid-March, he downed 2 Bf 109s. In April, another shared FW-190. The pace across those months was not the pace of the storybook ace, but the pace of a working combat pilot on bomber escort duty, moments of intense engagement, separated by hours of weaving formation flight, attention divided between the bombers below and the sky above, throttled back, burning fuel against the clock. By the time the 352nd converted to P-51 Mustangs in April 1944 and Bryan's first tour ended, he had 5 confirmed aerial victories, just below the 5-kill threshold that designates an ace. He had also been a flight leader, which meant responsibility for the men in his element, as well as the Germans in front of him. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not a glamorous aircraft in the way the P-51 would become. It was large and wide and heavy, its Pratt & Whitney radial engine producing a sound on takeoff that rattled the airfield at the far end. At altitude, it was fast, and it was durable. The radial engine could absorb battle damage that would stop an inline liquid-cooled engine permanently and keep running. What it could not do was follow the bomber stream all the way to the target. Its range on internal fuel capped the depth of escort it could provide. The P-47 groups flew with the bombers to a point and then turned back, leaving the B-17s to continue alone into the flak concentrations and the German fighter defenses in the deep penetration zone. Bryan flew that half-escort through the winter and spring of 1943-44, watching the bombers pass the turnback point with the specific quality of helplessness that came from knowing what was waiting for them and not being able to follow. The second Schweinfurt raid in October 1943, before Bryan's group had even completed its own formation and deployment, had demonstrated what happened to formations without coverage in the deep zone. 60 B-17s lost, 291 crewmen gone, in a single afternoon over a ball bearing plant in Bavaria. The P 47 escort pilots of the 8th Air Force flew what their aircraft's fuel system allowed and understood, with considerable clarity, the limits of what they could provide. By the time the 352nd converted to the P-51D and Bryan began his second tour in August 1944, the situation had changed in a way that mattered. The Mustang's Merlin engine and its ability to carry external fuel tanks extended the escort range to Berlin and back from eastern England. The deep penetration zone that had been undefended in 1943 was no longer undefended. Bryan flew into Germany in the summer and autumn of 1944 in an aircraft doing something categorically different from what he had flown the year before. He had seen the cost of the gap. He understood what filling it meant. He went home. He married Frances in the spring of 1944. He returned to his unit in early August, assigned a new P-51D-10 with little 13 painted on the cowling. His crew chief had worked on the engine magic, Bryan called it, that made his Mustang the fastest P-51D in the 352nd Fighter Group. He kept the polished aluminum fuselage bright enough that it reflected the sky around it. The summer of 1944 had moved the war substantially since Bryan left in the spring. Normandy had happened. The breakout at St. Lo had happened. Paris had been liberated. The front was in Belgium and approaching the German border. The Luftwaffe had suffered severe attrition through the summer's fighting and the sustained escort campaign. The strategic picture, to anyone reading a newspaper in the United States, looked like a war approaching its conclusion. To anyone reading operational reports in England, it looked like a war that had roughly 6 months of the most attritional combat still ahead of it, against an enemy who was defending his own territory and had nothing left to negotiate with. Bryan flew back into this on September 27, 1944, north of Frankfurt, and shot down 2 Bf-109s and damaged a third. 6 months away from combat, a new aircraft, a changed war, and the reflexes held. He added 2 kills to his total and brought his confirmed score to 6.5. He was an ace twice credited and an experienced combat leader, and November was coming. The popular story of the American fighter ace during the Second World War has a tendency to circle around a few fixed points: the score, the aggression, the natural gift for air combat that produced the score and expressed the aggression. The ace as exceptional individual, winning through qualities that cannot be taught. The numbers stand in for everything else. What kept pilots alive over Germany in 1944 was more complicated than that, and Bryan's record on November 2nd is more interesting than any simplified telling allows. The Luftwaffe in the autumn of 1944 was in genuine crisis. Its fuel supply had been critically reduced by the oil campaign. Its replacement pilot training had been compressed to the point where men were entering combat with hour counts that would have been considered inadequate 3 years earlier. German formation tactics had deteriorated under the pressure of continuous attrition. By most measurements, the Luftwaffe was losing the air war over Germany. And yet the Luftwaffe killed 28 American fighters on November 2nd, 1944, on a day when the larger battle went badly for it. Germany still had experienced pilots in its Fightergruppen men with hundreds of hours in combat, flying aircraft that were, in skilled hands, competitive with the P-51D at altitude, and who knew the sky over the Reich with the intimacy of having spent years defending it. The arithmetic of a turkey shoot at the formation level did not reach down to the individual encounter between 2 skilled pilots. One very good German pilot in the right position was still capable of killing one very good American pilot, independent of what was happening to the 200 other aircraft around them. Bryan had learned the inverted vertical reversement from a skilled instructor pilot during his training, and it existed at the edge of normal doctrine for good reasons. The maneuver required the pilot to put the aircraft into an extreme and disorienting attitude at combat speed, trusting that the Mustang structure could absorb the stress, that his own spatial awareness would survive the violence of flying inverted at altitude, and that his execution would be clean enough to put him where he needed to be when it was over. An aircraft performing the maneuver was, for the seconds it took, not in a position to do anything useful offensively. If there were 2 pursuers instead of 1, the maneuver was a worse option. Bryan had filed the maneuver away for when nothing else worked. He had been right to wait. Something else is worth naming before the battle itself. By November 1944, The 8th Air Force's bomber escort mission had changed the shape of air combat over Germany in a way that is easy to miss when the numbers take over the story. In 1942 and 1943, the American heavy bombers had flown deep penetration missions without fighter cover because no fighter had the range to go with them all the way to the target and back. The losses were catastrophic. The second Schweinfurt raid in October 1943 cost 60 B-17s in a single day. The bomber crews endured it without fighter protection because there was nothing to send. The P-51D Mustang changed that. With its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and its distinctive slipper fuel tanks hung under the wings, the Mustang could escort bombers to Berlin and back from bases in eastern England. The 352nd Fighter Group converted to the P-51D in April 1944, and the aircraft's arrival over Germany in force through the summer and autumn of that year shifted the terms of the air battle. The Luftwaffe could no longer rely on attacking the bombers in the deep penetration zone with the expectation that the American escorts had turned back. The escorts were there. What this meant, in practice, was that the Luftwaffe had to fight through the fighters to reach the bombers. Some days, as November 2nd showed, skilled German pilots in armored aircraft could still slip through. But the Bf-109 Gruppen that climbed to intercept the bombers were meeting P-51s at altitude, and the P-51D was at least the equal of the Bf-109G at the heights where bomber escort fought. The advantage in any individual encounter came down to pilot skill, aircraft preparation, and the geometry of how the fight began. The geometry on November 2nd went wrong for Bryan in the middle of an otherwise successful engagement. That it went wrong not because of inexperience or error, but because he encountered a German pilot who was operating at an exceptional level is, perhaps, the most honest thing that can be said about the day. The fight found its bottom. 2 skilled men, 2 capable aircraft, one of them needing to find a way to survive. The morning of November 2nd at RAF Bodny began in the dark, as combat mornings did. Crews roused before sunrise, bussed to the briefing rooms, given the target. By the accounts of airmen who flew Merseburg multiple times through 1944, the character of the briefing when that target came up was consistent. A specific quality of recognition that passed through a room of men who understood what had been asked of them before anything else was said. The flight to the target took the better part of 2 hours each way. 500 miles of English countryside falling away below, then the gray of the Channel, then the occupied coast, then Germany opening up the farms and forests and rivers of a country that had organized considerable portions of its national industry around the problem of shooting down what was coming. The P-51D cruised at high altitude with the Merlin engine pulling hard, the cockpit cold at that height despite the heating system, the oxygen mask tight against the face, the landscape below acquiring the compressed, map-like quality it always took at altitude. Bryan kept his aircraft's polished aluminum bright, and in certain angles of light it mirrored the sky so cleanly that the plane was harder to see from above. Small advantages mattered at this stage of the war, and the best pilots knew which ones to cultivate. The 352nd Fighter Group was assigned to escort the 1st Bombardment Division's B-17s. George Preddy, the group's leading ace, having returned from a stateside warbond tour on October 28th, and been assigned command of the 328th Fighter Squadron that same day, was leading the squadron on his first mission as its commander. He was flying a brand new P-51D-15. He made the first sighting call in the clipped, information-dense language that years of combat had compressed into something that could survive radio static. Hello, Topsy. This is Ditto Black Leader. 50-plus bandits headed for the Big Friends. What followed, while the B-17s flew on toward Leuna through the flak, was in many respects a decisive interception. The Bf-109s of 2/JG-3 and JG-27, climbing to reach the American bombers, flew directly into the 200 or more P-51 Mustangs of 4 escorting fighter groups, the 20th, 352nd, 359th, and 364th, before they could gain the altitude and position needed to attack the bombers. The German historians Hans Ring and Werner Gerbig, in their chronicle of JG-27's operations, described the result as a turkey shoot. 2/JG-3 alone lost 23 Bf-109s in the engagement, while claiming only 3 American aircraft and one B-17 in return. But while the Mustangs occupied the climbing Bf-109s, the Sturmgruppe units specially organized and trained assault groups flying heavily armored Focke-Wulf FW-190s, built specifically for close-range attacks on American bomber formations, managed to pass through the fighter screen and reach the B-17s. The 4/JG-3 attacked the 91st Bomb Group, and 2/JG-4 hit the 457th Bomb Group. Together, the Sturmjäger claimed 21 B-17 flying fortresses in approximately 3 minutes of concentrated fire from behind. The cost to the Sturmgruppe was severe. JG-3 lost 15 of its 39 Sturmbach aircraft, and 2/JG-4 lost 16 of 22 fighters and was nearly destroyed as an operational unit, but the heavy bombers died in clusters when the armored FW-190s found them. Bryan led his flight of 6 P-51s into the middle of an estimated 50 enemy aircraft. He shot down the lead Bf-109 of the formation to open the engagement. Then he found himself alone in the center of what was, by any reasonable assessment, an untenable situation. Fighter combat at that level of intensity fragmented formations almost immediately. A flight of 6 became 3 pairs, then 6 individuals, within seconds of first contact, each aircraft dealing with the immediate geometry of whoever was trying to kill it. Bryan's wingmen and the rest of the flight fought their own engagements. The battle was too large and too fast for anyone to maintain formation integrity. Bryan downed the lead aircraft and found 2 more in the minutes that followed, making 3 kills in a fight that his Distinguished Service Cross citation would describe as taking place with Bryan, alone, and in the midst of many enemy aircraft who were unusually aggressive and attacking vigorously. What those minutes looked like from inside a single cockpit cannot be fully reconstructed from any existing record. Bryan's own accounts across the years were compressed, the summary language of a man describing something that resisted summary. But the nature of a large, dispersed fighter engagement at altitude in 1944 is consistent across the accounts of pilots who survived them. Reduced, fragmented, comprehensible only in pieces, the broad tactical picture replaced by immediate geometry. There were no formation calls to wait for, no wingmen to check with. There was the aircraft in front of him or behind him or crossing his arc, and the decision about what to do with that aircraft, made in fractions of a second from the accumulated knowledge of what had worked and what had not over 2 years of the same. Bryan was aggressive in the engagement. The DSC citation describes him pressing a single pass at 8 Bf-109s, shooting 2 down in flames and damaging a third. That aggression was not recklessness, it was the kind of forward pressure that a combat pilot accumulates toward when the geometry allows it, pressing the attack because stopping or reversing surrenders the initiative. And surrendering the initiative in a dispersed fight is how a pilot goes from being the pursuer to being the pursued. He was moving through the German formation, taking shots when the angles presented themselves, keeping the Mustang pointed at the problem in front of him. The first kill opened the formation structure. The lead aircraft going down signaled to the other German pilots that there was a threat in close proximity, and the formation's collective attention divided between maintaining its approach to the bombers and dealing with what had appeared in its middle. Bryan was inside that divided attention, which gave him the brief windows he needed for the second and third kills. He was not methodical in the sense of stopping to assess after each one. He was continuous, the same forward momentum that had taken him into the formation in the first place, carrying him through the next engagement before the previous one had finished resolving. After the third kill, he was the problem the German formation was focused on. And then he was simultaneously attacked himself. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Bryan had no name for the pilot who appeared in his 6 o'clock. He would never have a name for him. The Ace was the shorthand he used decades later, and what the name captured was simple. This German pilot was operating at a level Bryan had not encountered all afternoon, possibly at a level Bryan had not encountered in his entire time over Germany. The aircraft itself was part of it. I don't know what that German was flying because his plane was hotter than any Me-109 I had encountered, Bryan told an interviewer. The combination of a well-maintained Bf-109 with whatever extra preparation the German's crew had done and the skilled hands flying it produced something that, in the seconds of recognition Bryan had available, was markedly more dangerous than what he had faced all day. He tried the first brakes. He pulled hard left, combining a heading and altitude change the way in. Experienced combat pilot would, creating the geometry that normally produced separation. The German matched him. He reversed and pulled the other direction, the Mustang shuddering through the transition and coming around in the arc that should have put the pursuer wide. The German followed. He used altitude, climbing to try to create an angle advantage for the dive that would follow, burning airspeed against the possibility of creating distance. Still there. The tracers were close enough now that Bryan could pick them out individually against the pale November sky over central Germany. There is no surviving record of how long this sequence lasted. Bryan estimated the entire engagement from the first kill to the moment he turned for England at 15 to 20 minutes. The duel with the German ace occupied some fraction of that. But the compression of combat time is real, and pilots who have described extended maneuvering contests at altitude consistently note that perception of duration distorts under the physiological stress of hard G-turns at altitude, the sustained constriction of the oxygen mask, the physical work of forcing the aircraft through reversals at combat power. Minutes feel like seconds. Seconds feel like something without a name. What matters is the sequence. Bryan tried what he knew. The German had an answer for all of it, and Bryan arrived at the recognition that standard maneuvering was not going to save him. He reached for the maneuver. Bryan described it in his 1989 Museum of Flight oral history interview. The aircraft does the darndest thing you ever imagined. First, the tail snaps end to end with the nose and you fly up against the canopy, and then the aircraft corkscrews around underneath. You end up going 180 degrees in the direction you were originally headed. Much slower, but still 180 degrees off the other flight path. It is absolutely impossible for an aircraft behind you to see where you went. The mechanics required the pilot to unload the aircraft by releasing back pressure and pushing the stick forward at a specific moment, a counterintuitive input, when an enemy pilot is behind you, and every instinct argues for pulling. With the stick pushed forward at combat speed, the nose drove up and the tail dropped in an abrupt pitch-up. The aircraft's own inertia and the engine's torque carried it into a rolling, yawing departure from normal flight, the asymmetrical corkscrew that Bryan described. The resulting motion changed heading, altitude, and airspeed simultaneously, and it happened too fast and too irregularly for any pursuing pilot to track with his eyes through the transition. For the German behind Bryan, the target simply ceased to occupy the space it had been occupying. There was no predictable arc to follow, no lead angle to calculate, no course to extrapolate. The P-51D had gone somewhere outside the geometry of pursuit. What the Germans saw was a P-51D that was in one place and then was not in any identifiable place. Bryan came out of the corkscrew 180 degrees from his previous heading, lower and slower, with empty sky behind him. "I didn't go back looking for him," Bryan said. He said it twice, in the same tone, with the cadence of someone who had turned the decision over many times and arrived at the same place. There was no shame in it. He had done the best flying of his life. He had used a maneuver no one behind him could follow. The German was gone, and that was enough. What came next was a pause without a precise duration. Bryan described it as needing time to calm down before he could engage again, and the physiological reality of what he had just been through supports that account. A sustained hard maneuvering contest at altitude in an oxygen mask produces a specific kind of physical depletion, the muscles exhausted from fighting G-forces through reversals, the cardiovascular system taxed by the demand of sustaining blood flow to the brain through turns that push the body toward blackout, the concentration consumed by processing three-dimensional spatial information at speeds that strain the limits of human perception. The inverted vertical reversement had added to that physical toll the disorientation of flying against every instinct for several seconds at combat speed. Bryan had come out of it intact, and he had the sky behind him. At 25,000 feet in early November, the sky outside the canopy was a deep, cold blue, the specific shade of high altitude, darker and cleaner than anything visible from the ground. The horizon slightly curved at this height, the landscape below visible in pieces through the cloud breaks as a winter-gray patchwork of fields and roads. The sound inside the cockpit was the Merlin engine and the slip of air past the canopy and the background of his own oxygen-assisted breathing. There was no German behind him. There was ammunition in some of the guns, enough to matter if the angles were right. And there was Germany in front of him with several minutes of fight remaining before fuel considerations would force the turn toward England. He turned back toward the engagement. It took a while for him to calm down, by his own account. The entire battle from first kill to the moment he broke off lasted no more than 15 to 20 minutes. What had happened to him in the middle of it, the encounter with the German, who was better than anyone else he had met that day, occupied some fraction of those minutes. The fraction did not need to be large to be total. The first went down without complication. By the time Bryan closed on the second, his aircraft had worked through most of its ammunition across the afternoon's fighting. The P-51D carried 6 .50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 3 in each wing, and they had been firing in bursts since before the first kill. The ammunition loads in the wing bays were not infinite. One by one, as the belts ran out and the mechanisms stressed and jammed under sustained use, the guns fell silent. Bryan closed to firing range on the 5th German aircraft of the afternoon with one gun working. He used it. He closed to short range, the way he had always preferred by the accounts of his combat style, and fired the single remaining gun until the Bf-109 went down. When the 5th German aircraft fell, Donald Bryan turned his Mustang toward England. He was deep inside Germany, and he had done what he came to do. That is what turning for home at the right moment looks like. The final accounting for the 352nd Fighter Group on November 2, 1944, was 39 confirmed aerial victories against 2 losses. George Preddy, commanding the 328th Fighter Squadron on his first day in that role, shot down a Bf-109, while his squadron was credited with 24 kills in total. Bryan's 5 represented the largest individual contribution to the group's day and placed him in a very small group. Across the entire European campaign of World War II, 38 USAF pilots were credited with 5 or more aerial victories in a single mission, the threshold for what was designated an ace in a day. Bryan became one of them over Merseburg on November 2nd. That the achievement happened inside what the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey called the most dangerous target assignment of the air war, and that it happened only after Bryan survived an encounter with a German pilot who had every advantage before being turned away by a single practiced maneuver, is part of what the number cannot capture. The Distinguished Service Cross that the Army awarded Bryan for November 2nd did not mention the German pilot or the inverted vertical reversement. Military citations record outcomes rather than the interior geometry of survival. The citation described Bryan as alone and in the midst of many enemy aircraft who were unusually aggressive and attacking vigorously. Noted that he made a pass from astern at 8 Me-109s and shot 2 down in flames and damaged another, and recorded the final gun, having engaged the last enemy with but a single gun operating. It described his actions as extraordinary heroism and noted that they were exemplary of the highest traditions of the Army Air Forces. Bryan continued flying. During the Battle of the Bulge in December, the 352nd moved forward to Airfield Y-29 near Asch, Belgium, as the German offensive broke across the Ardennes. He damaged an Arado AR-234 jet bomber on December 21st, one of the new twin-jet aircraft Germany had begun deploying in small numbers. He shot down an FW-190 over Liège on December 23rd. In January 1945, he was appointed commanding officer of the 328th Fighter Squadron. George Preddy, who had led the squadron into the Merseburg fight, was dead by Christmas Day. Shot down over American lines in Belgium on December 25, 1944, killed not by a German pilot, but by American anti-aircraft fire, a friendly fire death at 25 years old, with 83 aerial victories. The leading American ace in the European theater, gone on Christmas morning while flying combat air patrol over the Ardennes. The 328th Fighter Squadron that Preddy had commanded for less than 2 months passed to Bryan in January 1945. Whether Bryan thought much about the particular shape of that succession, the squadron he had helped build passed through one of the finest pilots the 8th Air Force produced, arriving in Bryan's hands after Preddy died in the December sky over Belgium, the record does not say. Bryan's final aerial victory came on March 14, 1945. During the return leg of a bomber escort mission, His flight encountered an Arado AR-234 jet bomber. The jet could outrun Bryan's P-51D in a straight line with nothing to spare. Bryan did not try to outrun it. He read the Arado's flight path, calculated the turn geometry, and cut across the arc. When the jet passed beneath him, he rolled inverted and fired from approximately 100 yards. He put hits on both engines. The Arado slowed. Bryan rolled out behind it and followed it into the ground. His 13th confirmed aerial victory. He flew 140 combat missions across 2 tours in 2 different aircraft types before the war ended. Under Bryan's command in the war's final months, the 328th Fighter Squadron continued its escort and ground attack work through the Rhineland campaign and the drive into Germany itself. He retired from the U.S. Air Force in November 1964 as a lieutenant colonel, having served in Japan with the 5th Air Force and in Air Defense Command. A replica of Little 1-3 is on permanent display at the National Museum of the Mighty 8th Air Force in Pooler, Georgia. He died May 15, 2012, in Adel, Georgia, at the age of 90. Francis Norman Bryan Little 1, the name on every aircraft Donald Bryan ever flew in combat, outlived him. The oil campaign, of which November 2, 1944 was one engagement, belongs to the better documented strategic chapters of the European War and among the ones most clearly connected to observable consequences. Albert Speer, who ran Germany's armaments production through the war's final years and who had an accountant's relationship with industrial cause and effect, wrote after the war that the oil campaign was the single most damaging blow to Germany's military capacity. Not the bombing of cities, not the attacks on aircraft manufacturing or on rail infrastructure or on any other high-priority target category. The oil plants. By the autumn of 1944, the Luftwaffe was cutting training hours because there was not enough aviation fuel to train at the rate the war required. Armored units were immobilized for lack of diesel. The German army's collapse in the final months owed something to its inability to move, and its inability to move owed something to what the American heavy bombers had been doing, at enormous cost, over Leuna and sites like it since the spring. The 8th Air Force returned to Leuna after November 2nd, again and again, until production finally stopped in March 1945. The campaign required 22 American attacks in all, dropping more than 18,000 tons of bombs on the facility across 6,552 bomber sorties. Each visit cost something. November 2nd cost more than most. What the fuel crisis meant at the level of the individual soldier and airman on both sides is documented in accounts that accumulated through 1944 and into 1945. German tank crews in the Ardennes offensive of December 1944, Hitler's last major attempt to split the Allied lines in the West, drove forward with the explicit expectation that they would capture American fuel depots to sustain the advance. Several of the Panzer spearhead columns ran out of fuel and stopped within days of the offensive's opening, tanks immobilized on roads while the battle continued around them. The 5th Panzer Army's advance elements reached the Meuse approaches and then stalled for want of diesel. The operation that was meant to reach Antwerp and divide the Allied armies collapsed partly on the arithmetic of liters per kilometer in vehicles that consumed fuel at rates the German logistics chain could no longer support. The planes that did not fly because there was no fuel to put in them are harder to enumerate. The Luftwaffe's training program contracted steadily through 1944 as successive classes of pilot trainees were pushed through abbreviated programs and sent to operational units that were already outnumbered and outranged. The pilots Bryan encountered in November and December 1944 ranged from men like the unnamed German ace who had the measure of him for several minutes over Merseburg, experienced, skilled, flying a well-maintained aircraft to its limits, to men who had received enough training to get airborne and not enough to survive against a combat veteran. That disparity, visible in the kill-loss ratios of individual engagements, was the oil campaign's cumulative work made manifest in individual pilots. Germany's response to the Leuna attacks measures the plant's importance in reverse. After the first raid on May 12, 1944, the Reich mobilized a repair effort that one post-war German account described as involving tens of thousands of workers, many of them coerced, working continuously to restore capacity. Smoke generators were pre-positioned before subsequent raids to obscure the plant's outline. Decoy buildings were constructed outside the perimeter to absorb bombs that missed the target. The 14th Flak Division reconfigured its gun batteries after each raid to counter the approach angles the Americans had used. The effort to protect and restore Leuna was continuous, systematic, and expensive in its own terms, and it slowed but could not stop the progressive reduction that the sustained campaign produced. By March 1945, production at Leuna had ceased. Not because a single raid ended it, but because 22 raids over 10 months at the cost of hundreds of aircrews, thousands of damaged aircraft, and the working lives of the men who kept going back had collectively exceeded the German repair organization's capacity to recover. The last bombs fell on a plant that was already close to dark. The contribution Leuna had made to German military power since 1927 ended not in a single dramatic destruction, but through accumulation, each raid adding to a total that eventually became irreversible. Speer's post-war accounting of which offensive hurt Germany most came from inside the machine. He watched it break from the inside, read the production curves, sat with the armaments ministers who reported on what the armies could no longer do because the fuel was not there. What he identified was the systemic vulnerability of an economy built on synthetic fuel, attacked the plants repeatedly and hard enough, and the military's ability to project force collapses at the root. Proving that analysis correct required the sacrifice of thousands of men. Leuna was where it was proved. The men who flew the bombers into those flak boxes day after day knowing the numbers, knowing the odds, and going anyway because the orders said to go are the part of the air war that popular memory has sometimes struggled to hold. The fighter aces are easier to remember individually because their scores produce a legible narrative with names attached to numbers. The bomber crews are remembered less specifically because their contribution was collective and cumulative, and the nature of the work left less room for the individual story to stand clear of the group. A B-17 crew was 10 men. The formations numbered hundreds of aircraft. The mission record is a log of targets and tonnages and loss percentages. What is harder to hold is that each percentage was a crew, and each crew was 10 names. And by the autumn of 1944, the men who had flown Merseburg before were flying it again because the mission required someone to fly it, and they were there. Donald Bryan did not save the day over Merseburg. He saved himself, and then he kept fighting. What the day turned on was 638 crews who flew through a flak box in a fighter attack and dropped their bombs on a target they had every reason not to approach, and then went back 21 more times until it stopped producing fuel. What Bryan did was survive a specific encounter with a skilled German pilot, using something he had prepared for and waited to use, and then complete his mission with one gun. The maneuver is the part of the story that sounds like the mythology, the one technique, the decisive moment. What does not fit the mythology is what Bryan said about it afterward. He did not go looking for the German again. He had already done what the mission required. He turned for home. There is a particular kind of military virtue in knowing when you have done enough and doing it. There is a related virtue in keeping something difficult for a long time, against the possibility that the moment will come when nothing else will work. Bryan had carried the inverted vertical reversement through more than 2 years of military service, months of combat, and an ocean crossing, and he used it once. Once was the right number. He went home to Georgia when the war ended. He raised a family. He worked and served and lived 90 years. The plane named after his wife is in a museum. The maneuver is in the record. Donald S. Bryan, Captain, 8th Air Force, 328th Fighter Squadron, 352nd Fighter Group. 13 1/3 confirmed aerial victories. 140 combat missions. Distinguished Service Cross. 3 Distinguished Flying Crosses. 14 Air Medals. He is buried at the Christ Episcopal Church Urn Garden in Valdosta, Georgia. The German pilot whose name Bryan never learned, the ace, by Bryan's own shorthand, survived November 2nd, 1944, so far as the record shows. 2/JG-3 lost 23 Bf-109s that afternoon, some of those pilots taken prisoner and some able to fly again. One of them had been close enough to kill Bryan. He found instead that his target had ceased to be in the position it was supposed to be, and he never regained it. He is not in the record by name. He is there only by the effect he had on one afternoon in November, which was to push a California farm boy into reaching for something he had prepared and saved and never used, and using it exactly right. The 380 men aboard the 38 B-17s lost on November 2nd deserve to be remembered by name if history still carries their names. The 28 fighter pilots gone that same day deserve the same. The workers at Leuna, 35,000 of them, 10,000 held there by force as prisoners, and forced laborers who survived each raid that came deserve to be acknowledged as people who endured something that was not their war. And for what the veterans said in Normandy in the words they found at the end of long lives, trying to put language to something that language was never designed to hold. They were kids. Most of them were 18, 19, 20 years old. They did what they were asked to do, at a cost that could not be compensated, for reasons that had to be sufficient. Bryan flew 140 missions and came back from all of them. He knew what it cost others not to. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.